it's so interesting, to say the least. That's cool. Okay, hi everybody, and welcome to my channel. As any sort of generic YouTuber might actually say, personally, I have to introduce everybody to whatever it happens for me to be doing here, which may or may not seem as coherent due to the fact that, perhaps I haven't posted a lot of content. As of right now, there isn't much videos you can watch or anything of that nature, but rather I was postponing this specific recording in of itself, this sort of intro, this sort of welcome message to the channel, for one primary reason, although it's a little more specific than what I'm about to state. And it has to do with the fact that I didn't particularly envision a single direction of the channel in so far as content is concerned, for example. And rather, I started off with, something that's fairly mainstream, fairly common, fairly perhaps even uninteresting, which is benchmark videos for video games. I mean, can it get any more generic than that? It's actually rather, I mean, I find it informative. I find it as being somewhat entertaining if you're actually willing to watch the frame rate and the gameplay at the same time, if you happen to be interested in both the technical details as well as the entertainment aspect of the video. I personally found myself growing up with these things as I gradually developed more and more interest in technology. And so it was a leap forward for me in creating this sort of vision, as in, if I ever started to post content, what would it be like in the beginning? Would I be interested in creating sort of video game documentaries right from the start, or should I start with something small like video game benchmarks, which are obviously easy to create? I don't find them to be particularly effortful. And so I thought this would be a good impetus to any sort of vision, any sort of development of a future vision that I have in regards to the channel. I was thinking that this channel could branch out to maybe other multiple channels, or I could have, I don't know exactly how it's going to go. I don't know if I am going to create particular sections for this channel dedicated to specific types of content, which is something that I definitely always wanted to embody for a variety of reasons. One has to do with the fact that I primarily am striving, and I believe I'm perpetually striving towards attaining more and more knowledge, and I want to know as much about everything as possible, or at least the relevant things in my life, which I also find to be extremely interesting, extremely valuable, extremely functional, and at the same time somewhat necessary. So for example, anything ranging from the realm of finances and obviously, this sort of self-development culture, which I know is diluted with plenty of irrelevant videos, which I know is sort of diluted with this sort of like amassed body of creators that simply restate the same messages over and over again. And I find that to be truly exhaustive as well as exhausting. Imagine just opening up YouTube daily and seeing all these little screens in which, for whatever reason, every single day there's a new secret for you to uncover, but the secret is just simply made publicly. It's put out there. It's highly marketable. I've taken a look into this, and I at least from afar and from a subjective perspective, I find some of these YouTube practices, kind of exhaustive, kind of uninteresting. I don't consider them to be entirely convincing. I think they're quite. I think the realm of YouTube isn't what it used to be, in the sense that it's now diluted with all these types of videos that are clickbait, and that basically they don't provide any additional value to you. Moreover, it is true that perhaps the types of content that I'm willing to create is may not fit every single category of people. Some people might find it a complete waste of time because, for example, so if I did video game commentaries, or if I tried to make little videos about, the visual culture within a particular game, it's like, why do I care about that game to begin with when I find the game as being a waste of time? And why would I in particular care about the visual culture within that game when I don't care about the game to begin with? So it's a rather risky territory. It's rather an unpredictable horizon. I know it's quite successful. I know that this type of content is highly appreciated, but within the right community. And so this is sort of the hope that I'm starting off with. I'm hoping to create as many videos which are also informative. I want for people to know more about visual culture. I want for them to know more about video games, about technology, and things of that nature, while having, I believe, my own subjective approach to things. I believe I can perhaps add some value in this respect and not just make it like some standard boring commentary. Maybe there's something intellectual about video games that perhaps we haven't thought of. So, for example, I mean, there's plenty of video games in my experience that have included elements of other types of visual culture, for example, or they make all these interesting references to, history, for example, or to portraiture or painting or sculpture, architecture, and obviously not just that. They're if you take a look at the Assassin's Creed franchise, and the fact that it states at the very beginning that it has a foundation on history, on religion. It has been founded on knowledge of history, knowledge of religions, knowledge of habits, and so on and so forth. And I think that it beautifully creates this synthesis between an entertainment, an object of entertainment, which is a video game, what we generically think as a video game, and this element of history. I mean, how many people cannot relate with the fact that perhaps the very foundations of history that they've learned has to do, or strictly is very linked to Assassin's Creed, and sort of the exploration that they've taken part in the game, and looking at all of these buildings and so on and so forth. I find that to be truly interesting. Now, to actually sum up, I don't want to make this video too long, although I could talk about a variety of subjects in the introduction. I want for everything to be as elaborate as possible, so perhaps you know what you're actually getting into if you want to come along, and I would be very much glad if you came along. I'm willing to create this sort of beautiful and interesting, challenging community at the same time. I want for it to be some sort of an engaging, um, some, I would perceive it perhaps like a Reddit forum. I'm unsure of that. I want for people to challenge ideas. I want for them to interact with my content. I want to put myself out there in this fashion, and obviously, bring along a lot of useful information, a lot of interesting information. It doesn't necessarily have to be useful or pragmatic or functional in the real world. I genuinely hope it embodies a multitude of, let's say, objectives. I hope it embodies a multitude of properties, for example. So if you use my content to relax in your time off work, for example, or during break times, or if you want to take a break from your studies and learn something interesting, I would be very much glad to be present in your life in that manner. I don't know exactly why. I don't know exactly why I talked about video games in particular, because they're only a singular element out of many that I would like to talk about. But perhaps the question that may arise is like, why do you want to teach me all of these things when I can just use the mainstream media, or I can read some article or something along those lines? Now, a question for me that arose before I wanted to record this video, and before I actually created the channel in of itself, has to do with the fact that, well, what are the possible limitations of what I'm trying to do here? Because one of them, and I thought about this, in a cursory way, but nevertheless, I think it's quite plausible. I think it can be interpreted in this fashion. I think people can think of that in a way. Why would you have to teach me when you're a 23-year-old? Well, I think it's rather irrelevant. Personally, I find that to be irrelevant. I think that age-wise, the capacity of someone to be entertaining, to be informative at the same time, or embody multiple types of constructive values, or anything that can be highly appreciated especially in our contemporary times, I think it's just a bit of a far fetch from the idea. It's not functional. Because I don't find it appropriate to disregard someone strictly off of the fact that they have a particular age and so on. And you probably already know what I'm trying to infer here. Now, I wanted to talk about, I was thinking of actually recording this separately, partly not to well, for all of the information that I want to put forth to be cumbersome in any way. And but I wanted to address specifically the theme of the channel and sort of in terms of its mm, in terms of its aesthetic, the way that I created the logo, the inspiration sources, and so on and so forth, and sort of its foundation and my personal vision when I created this channel. So it's called synthetically analytical. And the reason why it's called that is, well, there's multiple reasons. I strongly link it to, now it's called synthetically analytical because I associate it with this dialectical discourse that you may find in, for example, human history. Now, if you take a look at history, if you take a look at human culture, if you take a look at human production of things, and, even when discussing political agendas, you can perhaps identify some dominant elements. And there's this sort of interesting dialect that's always existing. So, for example, in art and architecture, there's this opposition between geometric functional lines and sort of the beauty and sensuality of organic lines. So you can think of perhaps functionalist architecture or Bauhaus architecture. We're talking about the beginning of the 20th century. And right before that, we had this phenomenon in the Western world called Art Nouveau, for example, which embodied, sinuous lines, organic forms, and things of that nature. Well, similarly, in philosophy, or perhaps in language or in human creation, there's this opposition perhaps between something synthetical, something that is being created, and deconstruction, the deconstruction of an already pre-existing element, which is called analyzing the particular object, which is the analytical approach to that particular object. And I find that to be truly fascinating because I sort of associate it to philosophy. I associate it to something that's deep. I associate it to something that has to do with knowledge, as well as I associate it with this sort of technical deconstructivist approach that you can have in regards to anything in the world, as well as this creative, entertaining element perhaps that could emerge out of something. And it doesn't necessarily have to be entertainment, but it can certainly be creative. It can certainly be a manifestation of a new form. It can certainly be a manifestation of a new form, something that sparks interest, something that grasps your attention, and so on and so forth. And I truly find that fascinating. I thought it was a good, how should I call it? I thought it was a good name for the channel, and I reached this conclusion fairly quickly because, first of all, I loved the way that it sounds, and secondly, I thought of an actual way. I believe it's a subjective way, but nevertheless, I think it's also a widely accepted way of representing visually this difference between something synthetical and something that is analytical. Opposition through a geometrical form, like the cube, for example, and one side of it has these sort of electric neon lights, which is something that we associate with something synthetical, with something that's artificial, with something that you don't necessarily find in nature. Moreover, I actually wanted to create a connection with a type of electronic music, I suppose you can call it. It's actually a music genre. I know it's very popular these days. I know it's very appreciated for the fact that it takes us back to the 80s and 90s and this nostalgic era, and the specific lines of those particular times. By lines, I actually mean lines in terms of design. If you take a look at retro cars from the 80s, you're going to see them as being very boxy. They're very linear. They have very simple interiors. The first digital attempt of digitalizing the interiors of cars and making everything futuristic sort of links back to that era. But it's interesting how we contemporarily perceive it as being, retro. We think of it as being something of the past. That was certainly envisioning a brighter future, a future of, spaceships, for example, or of flying cars, and Back to the Future, as it used to be called, and obviously the popular creation with DeLorean. When you think of the 80s, try to think of the DeLorean. I think that's a good choice. Okay, so that was one side of the cube. It's synthetical. It's synthetic. It's made up of neon lights. It's made up of neon colors. Something that certainly artificial. And I associate this synthetic aesthetic with a particular music genre, which is called synthwave, and I know it's very popular these days. One of my favorite bands, actually, or I suppose musical groups, but rather it's just two people doing all the work. It's called The Midnight, and it's not the only one. There's a lot of synthwave bands, or again, artists that I truly value, I truly appreciate, and they constituted and they acted as a strong inspiration, with whom and they acted as a strong influence for me when thinking of this sort of opposition between elements. Because on the other hand, in my own individual life, and generally in, when I was attending university, matter of fact, broadly speaking, I always found myself to be more analytical. I tried to look at objects in a deconstructive way, and I was questioning all of these things about them. I was wondering, why does it look like that? What properties does it have? How can I get to the bottom of it in terms of knowledge, in terms of epistemology, which is the branch that studies knowledge. And I always had this innate curiosity about the world that was accompanied by a very, sometimes even radical enthusiasm. And I believe that somehow created a discrepancy between me and other people. I know plenty of people that haven't found me in any way enjoyable to be around or to speak to, strictly off of the fact that I'm so highly analytical and I use all these words, and why don't you take a break, or something like, or something along those lines. And I thought, well, maybe the issue is not with me, or even if there's an issue with me, I will try to find a pathway through this world in which these analytical capacities can be truly glorified in some sense, or can be put to use, can be functional, can be valued. And I know that there's people out there that think along the same lines as me, that would like have this intrinsic interest in knowledge, and they're looking to learn more, and so on and so forth. And this is how I sort of conceived of the idea for this channel, of the objective of this channel, which has to do with the fact that I want for it to be creative. I want for it to embody my creative production, and at the same time deconstruct elements, pre-existing elements of the world, things that I'm interested in, things that I'm passionate about, things which are also relevant to the world, things which are valued by the world, valued within our visual culture, within history. Because quite frankly, there's a lot of subjects I want to talk about, and video games are just simply one of them. I'm going to think about whether I'm going to, branch things out to multiple channels and sort of create separate content, and sort of create these little boxes in which I can keep everything organized so that everybody can have easy access to all this information without having to scroll through multiple types of irrelevant content, or just plainly things that they're not interested in. And so I'm glad you've watched this video. If you reached the very end of it, I'm glad you actually were here with me till the very end of the video. I'm very enthusiastic about this journey, and I'm glad to have you, if you're still going to be around for a very long time from now onwards. I'm glad if you would join me. I'm glad to hear any sort of constructive feedback you might have, or any sort of perspective and or knowledge or information and opinions that you would like to share with me. They would be more and more than welcome in the comments. And of course, I will look through all of the comments, and I will try to reply to them as best as I possibly can, and take great interest in this community that I'm trying to build. I'm curious on how it will unfold, and I'm curious on the significance and the value, perhaps, that I can bring to the world as well as to myself, because I want for this to be a constructive experience, and certainly an unforgettable one.